for our event for Bentham for Peer Review Week. We've got my friend and colleague, Professor Gareth Dyke, and tonight's topic is why you should be a peer reviewer. Gareth, how are you doing today?
Doing great, not too bad. Thank you very much. It's the week before peer review week, which is actually officially kicking off next week. But because we're ahead of the curve at Bentham Science, we've scheduled our webinar before peer review week. Fantastic. Scott, how are you? Everything okay with you?
Doing fantastically well. It's still quite hot here in Tokyo, otherwise doing great. Yeah. And as Gareth mentioned, we're a little bit ahead of peer review week, getting it in early this week. Getting it in early this year. And it's definitely a hot topic right now, isn't it, Gareth? There's definitely a lack of qualified peer reviewers out there, and journal editors such as yourself are always looking for more. Any thoughts that you would like our attendees to keep in mind as they watch your presentation today?
Yeah, this presentation is all about how you can be an effective peer reviewer, but also if you get an invitation to be a peer reviewer from a journal, like whether you should accept it or not, what you should do, whether that will be a good thing for your career or not. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Like many emails need to get sent out by journals to secure like people who are willing to do peer review. So this is all about your career and how you can get involved in the peer review process. Fantastic.
Absolutely. And there are many benefits to being a peer reviewer, and also some caveats, some things to think about before you accept that next peer review. And our guests are filing in. So we've got a great group of guests today from all around the world. If you're joining us, no matter where you're joining us from, please let us know where you are in the world. And yeah, feel free to type in the chat box and let us know where you are and where you're from.
Yeah, I've just opened up the chat box so everybody can chat with everybody else. You can get in touch. You can let us know. And I see that people are already doing so. Welcome for our colleagues from India. One fantastic. Poland, Nigeria, Egypt. I'm in Hungary and Budapest. Scott, where are you? You're in
Tokyo, Japan.
Nice one. Look at that international audience. Malaysia, Sierra Leone, Algeria, Zimbabwe. That's great. It's fantastic to see Turkey, Bhutan, but presently in Thailand. Wow, fantastic. Great to see so many people joining us today. Really good. And welcome on behalf of Bentham Science. Scott.
Thanks everyone for joining us. We know that you're busy and your time is valuable. So thank you always. For those who are coming back and joining us again, I see some familiar names in our list of attendees. Thank you always for joining our events and taking time and spending time with us. And on behalf of Bentham Science, we have an invitation to librarians. If you are a library sciences manager, then you can get a free trial of Bentham's library for free, absolutely for free, with no obligation, for 3 months. Gareth, tell us why this is such a great deal for librarians.
This is great because Bentham has some fantastic content, more than 40 journals with impact factors. It's even more than that now after the most recent Clarivate releases. So do have a look. Do scan this QR code if you're a librarian, or recommend this QR code to your librarian, because all of the researchers at your institution can access all of the Bentham content without any charge for the next 3 months. So that is a great opportunity, we think, for you to see the kind of content that Bentham Science has available.
Fantastic. Okay, looks like we're ready to start. I think our guests are still slowly filing in, but maybe it's about time to start. Shall we kick off, Gareth? Are we ready?
I think so. Let's kick off. And don't forget that we'll be having a Q&A session a little bit later. We also run polls and quizzes in our events, so hopefully that will keep you awake if it's the evening where you are at the moment. I can see somebody saying that it's not audible. I hope that it is audible. I hope that everything's working okay. Don't worry if you don't hear us this time around. Everybody will get access to the event recording at the end, as well as a certificate. So brilliant stuff. Let's get cracking. Let's talk about why you should be a peer reviewer. And don't forget that in all of our events, Sidetrain, working with Bentham Science, we're talking around this academic publishing cycle, going from ideas, funding, data collection, journal selection, paper writing, submission, peer review and publication. And so if you are thinking that you'd like some training for your university, for your research institute, for your team on one of these other areas of the academic cycle, then do get in touch with Scott and I at the end, because we do these events all the time and we'd love to show up virtually. We'd love to show up virtually at your institution and do more of this kind of training. And I hope it's audible now. I hope that there's no background noise from my side. Do bear with us. Thank you so much once again for joining, and do let us know any questions or any comments as we go through our event today, which is all about peer review and, of course, publication, the process that we go through as researchers to get our papers published. That's peer review, and we'll talk about peer review in a little bit more detail in a moment. But the focus of this event is on you and answering those questions that you might have about peer review itself, but specifically why it's a good idea as a researcher to build your career by getting involved in the peer review process, because getting involved as a peer reviewer can be really beneficial to your career. So in this event, we're going to talk about 3 things. What is peer review? Quickly, a bit of a recap. Why you should consider becoming a peer reviewer, why you should accept those invitations from journals, get involved in the peer review process. And then I think we will talk thirdly about communication skills in the peer review process at the end of this event as well. So 3 things. Let's get going. Let's initially discuss what is peer review. And I'm sure that you're already thinking, well, I know all about this. I know what peer review is. I'm an expert researcher, but we do love this cartoon to get things started because, of course, usually the peer review process is not a very enjoyable process for researchers. They usually end up at the end of the peer review process getting their papers hopefully accepted, but feeling a little bit like they've been through a bit of an obstacle course on the way. It's not usually a very enjoyable experience. And so one of the things we try to do is help researchers understand the peer review process, manage the peer review process, and also make it more of an enjoyable, career-enhancing process. Because, of course, the main function of peer review is not to help you improve your paper. The main function of the peer review process is to help journals and publishers, the scientific, the academic community, filter content that ends up getting published in journals. Peer review filters research content for researchers. We trust content, we trust research papers that have been through the peer review process in our own work. We use them and we cite them in our own papers. And here's generally a summary of the process of peer review. It's the process, of course, that we use to judge the quality of academic papers submitted for publication in scholarly journals. So really, really, really important. And of course, in the academic community, peer-reviewed papers are thought to be reliable because they've undergone this process before publication. So it should be a positive process, even though it often is not. And we'll talk about that in a moment. It should help to improve your manuscript, your research paper, although that's not the main function of the peer review process, as we've just discussed. It helps us to advance the field, and it's a good idea, as will hopefully convince you in this event today, it's a good idea to get involved in the peer review process because you'll learn a good deal about the research, writing, and publication process. And many people also feel it's kind of an obligation in the research community to perform peer review in any case, which is a bit controversial and something that we'll come back to, I'm sure, in our Q&A session at the end. And here's another quick summary for you. Different kinds of peer review that different academic journals use. Single blind, where the reviewer is anonymous to the author, still the most common kind of peer review out there in the world's journals. Open, where nobody is anonymous and everything is open and visible, less common. Double blind, where of course you, the author, and the peer reviewer don't know each other's identity. Both the reviewer and the author are anonymized from each other. Very popular in certain parts of the world, becoming increasingly popular with different journals around the world. And something that's quite unique about Bentham, as we'll talk about in a moment, Bentham science only uses double-blind peer review. That's a unique characteristic of Bentham science. There's no opportunity for papers to be reviewed in any other way than double-blind. And so that's one reason that researchers really quite like the Bentham peer review process, because it is double-blind and people feel that often that removes any bias from the peer review process. The reviewers can't see the author's institutions, their countries, where they're working, for example, and the authors themselves don't know anything about the peer reviewers either. And we'll come back to that in a moment, but just a quick review, what peer review is and the different kinds that different journals tend to use. And of course, as you can see here, data from China and India in this Springer Nature study that we show on this slide increased numbers of researchers when given the choice, would you like your paper reviewed single blind or double blind? More people are picking that double blind peer review process. That is a way in which they feel that reviewer bias is being removed from the process. So very interesting statistics here. Would you like your paper reviewed double blind? It could remove bias from the process, and therefore you may wish to look at Bentham science as an option for your article. And this is another great image that we took from PLOS, the Public Library of Science, a complete overview of the different kinds of peer review that different journals use, which we're not going to go into in any detail in this event today, other than to say that it's worth knowing about the different kinds of peer review out there. Most journals use single blind review. Many journals use double blind review. Those are the two most common sorts. And you'll even encounter journals that give you, the author, the choice, as we saw on that survey from Springer Nature on the slide before. So let's have a quick look. Why don't you write? Give us a bit of information in the chat box. Scott, how are we doing? Everything okay so far?
Doing great. We've set up a short poll for our guests today just to see which kinds of peer review that you have experienced, although we haven't gone into them in detail. Here's a quick poll. You can tell us which ones that you've gone through before, and you can select as many types as you like. We've got single blind, where reviewers know the author's name, double blind, as Gareth was explaining, where the Bentham style of peer review, we've got both reviewers and authors' names are protected. We've got signed peer review, collaborative, portable, published, and post-publication. Let us know which ones you have experienced, either as an author or as a reviewer.
And we'll explain later, if you want to ask questions about the different kinds in our Q&A at the end of this event, we'll talk in more detail about these different options, but it is really well worth checking your journal when you've chosen a journal to make your submission to with your next research paper, what options are available to you as an author, because many journals give you a choice. Many publishers like Bentham will only use a single kind of peer review. And we feel very strongly that this kind, double blind, really doesn't allow any bias in the peer review process.
Great. Looks like the poll results are still trickling in. We'll end the poll here in just a moment and see which types of peer review our guests have experienced. We're going to end the poll now in 3, 2, 1. Let's take a look at the results. Okay, so we've got 48% of our guests have experienced single blind, 74% double blind, 24% signed, 14% collaborative, 7% portable, 12% published. Oh, that's interesting. And 10% post-publication. Does that line up with your expectations, Professor?
It absolutely does. I mean, I think we're seeing a larger proportion of double blind here because, of course, the single blind is the most common. But that's interesting. I mean, we are talking to the Bentham Science webinar audience here, of course. So many of our colleagues in this event will have previously submitted to Bentham Science. So that may explain that skew. But otherwise, absolutely. And we'd love to hear more feedback from you, perhaps in the chat box or in the Q&A at the end. Which do you feel was the best option, the fairest option for your research article? Fantastic. Right. let's move on and let's have a quick think about what our peer reviewers are looking for. When your paper gets sent into a journal, of course, if it's a reputable journal, it's going to be using peer review. Absolutely, it must be. What kinds of things are peer reviewers looking for when they evaluate research papers? Well, they're looking for a relevant hypothesis. They're looking for appropriate methodology. They're looking for good, accurate data analysis. They're looking for complete data. Often you will have to share all of the data that you used for your piece of research. And of course, valid conclusions as well. And we put this slide together based on the kinds of expectations that publishers around the world, journals around the world are providing to peer reviewers to help them evaluate submitted research. So it's a great idea to have a look at this checklist, both when you are doing a peer review next time for a journal, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but also as a researcher, because researchers are also peer reviewers. Of course, you've got to be an active researcher to be able to do an effective peer review. So this is a great checklist for you as well when thinking about putting a paper together. What should you include in it to make sure that your article has the best possible chance of surviving that peer review process? With the guys with baseball bats and saws, they're going to be looking at your paper. You're going to be running the gauntlet of the peer review process. Now, quickly, we wanted to just introduce Bentham's uniquely robust peer review process. And we would argue that this publisher is a good choice for authors because the publication process at Bentham is uniquely thorough. Bentham is rejecting 50 to 60% of submissions that come in, and many of those are being rejected after peer review. And so you can see here what's different about Bentham, double-blind peer review, but also the editor at the journal does not get to choose who the peer reviewers are. The journal peer reviewers are selected by Bentham's in-house manuscript processing system. So the point here is that the process is double-blind, but also the editor-in-chief at the Bentham Journal does not get to pick who the peer reviewers are, which takes away quite a lot of potential bias, both in terms of the editorial process and the peer review process itself. And it is definitely a fair statement to make here that Bentham has the most robust peer review process of any publisher, any major publisher. Double blind, no editor-in-chief involvement. The editor-in-chief just gets to decide when the paper comes into the journal. Does it fit with the journal scope? Yes or no? Okay, it does. The paper goes into the manuscript processing system, an in-house AI-based tool that Bentham uses. Reviewers are selected based on their own experience, based on their own background, and then they provide blinded, double-blinded reports back to the editor, who then makes a decision whether the paper should be accepted or not. And so this is great. This is really, really strong. And of course, you'll be aware of many of the issues in research integrity that we've seen over the last few years. This has not been the case at Bentham Science. Reviewers are carefully selected to match your paper. Double-blind reviews are carried out by researchers who've been vetted based on their background, their profile, and previous publications. Bentham peer reviewers are ranked within a pool of more than 60,000 active researchers based on previous performance, speed, and review utility. And as I mentioned already, editors at journals are not involved in reviewer selection, which is really important. This removes bias and dramatically reduces the risk of any research misconduct in the peer review process, which you won't have to look very far to realize has been going on quite a lot in the publishing industry recently, for example. So let's move on. Let's have a look at what happens in the process. I won't read this slide out, but the editor-in-chief initially performs quality checks on all papers submitted to Bentham journals, and then after those quality checks have been completed, the paper goes into the peer review system. And people often ask us when we do these kinds of events, does it take longer Well, no, actually, it doesn't take longer. This is happening within 4 to 6 weeks. So we will also at Bentham keep you informed of your paper's progress. You can check on our online manuscript processing system as well. So it doesn't actually take longer at Bentham to conduct the peer review process, even though the peer review process is uniquely robust. So let's have another poll. Let's have another think. And we've gone through some of these issues. I've highlighted a few. I'm sure Scott has a few more that he wants to bring to the surface. The second poll. Scott, how are we getting on? Everything okay?
Everything looks great. Our guests are active tonight, and that's fantastic to see. Thanks everyone for your comments and questions so far. And remember, we are having Q&A with Professor Dyke at the end of the event today. So feel free to share your questions in the Q&A box. But for now, we've got a quick poll. Gareth would like to know, what is a peer review problem that you have faced, either as an author or as a reviewer, I guess, Professor, right? And how were you able Well, first, were you able to solve it, yes or no? And if yes, how? So feel free to share your story at any time during the rest of the event, or if you have it in mind now, you can type it into the chat box and let us know what kinds of peer review problems you have faced and you've been able to solve.
Absolutely. And we won't.
Sorry, Professor, go ahead, please.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, like, we can come back to this later in the Q&A. We can talk about these a little bit later on in our event, can't we? If people are thinking about what they want to put in the chat box right now.
Absolutely. Please share with us your peer review stories. We'd love to hear them and talk about them at the end of the event today. So let us know any problems that you faced. Hopefully you were able to find solutions. So let us know in the chat box.
Could be the time that peer review has taken. It could be negative comments that you've gotten from a reviewer that then got overruled by the editor. It could be the editor moving the goalposts, as we like to say, where you get positive comments back on your paper, then it goes out for review again, and you get a second set that identify different issues. We've seen it all, but do give us your comments. Do give us some feedback on this particular question. Yeah, and I can see some people are already saying, you know, for the same manuscript, 2 positive and 1 negative comments, really confusing authors a lot. Absolutely. And we'll look at this, I think, a little bit later in the Q&A, right, Scott?
Absolutely. Yeah. Let us know your stories. We'd love to hear them.
Fantastic, fantastic. And we're always here to help. So if you're listening to this and thinking, well, it would be fantastic to have a webinar specifically for my university or specially for my research group on a particular topic, you've seen that wheel that we have, that hamster wheel of different stages in the research and publishing cycle, then do get in touch. We'd absolutely love to come along, show up virtually at your university. Let's talk a little bit now about why you should be a peer reviewer, why it's a good idea. If you get an invitation from a journal, it's a good idea to accept that invitation in most cases if the journal is reputable, because doing peer review can boost your career. It definitely can, and we'll talk about how that can happen in a moment. But do think, when you get that invitation from that journal, ask yourself, do I have any conflicts of interest? Do I know the authors in question on this paper? Have I worked with them in the past? Very important. If you feel there's a conflict of interest before you perform the review, write to the editor and flag that. Is this your area of expertise? Is this really your competency? And do you really have the time? Also, a very important consideration, because a poorly done peer review, a rushed peer review, will not make you look good to the journal and to the editor. So think about the time that it's going to take as well. And your responsibilities as a peer reviewer, very important to be responsible, very important to be thorough, and also very important to be positive if possible, because you're doing this for the research community. You're going to be conducting what we hope is a fair and balanced assessment of a colleague's work. You're there to assess its suitability for publication in that particular journal. And as you know, some publishers, some journals will help you more or less with this process. Others will just give you no help at all. But we're here to help. We provide training in doing peer review, helping researchers around the world. And benefits to you include that you will, I hope, develop a positive and reasoned attitude towards the research of others. You'll get to understand more about the journal production process. You'll get direct contact with editors at journals, for example. You can then use those skills to understand the editorial process, learn more about what happens to papers when they get submitted to journals. And of course, reading the work of others helps you to improve your interpretation and critical reading skills. Of course, you get access to lots more research at the cutting edge in your field. You can use that to improve your own skills. Stay up to date in your field. Learn how others write and structure their papers, which is a great thing to do. We always say if you want to learn how to write and put together a successful paper in a high impact factor journal, have a look at some successfully published in your field in high impact factor journals. Have a look at what submitted papers look like. Learn how to make better figures and tables and use this experience to develop your own style as a writing and publishing author. So a few more benefits, and as you can tell, we're very positive about the peer review experience as a career enhancing, career developing skill. Access to literature, critical experience, access to editors, new directions for your own research, as well as approaches that you can apply in your own writing and publishing to sell your work to journals. It's very, very important. You look at how other people do it. You look at how other successful researchers build their writing, build their articles. You can apply many of the same techniques in your own writing and publishing. But doing a peer review, as we've mentioned already, takes time, and you may not get much credit for it from your institution or from your research council, from your national government. This is something that's often done for the good of the research community. And as you start your peer review, a great technique when first looking at the paper that you've been asked to evaluate, ask yourself, is this research question important and interesting, or is it just trivial? Is anyone else going to really be interested in this research question? And the methods. The number one reason that papers tend to get rejected during the peer review process is because of inappropriate or poorly structured method sections. So a good technique to get into the paper that you're looking at as a reviewer as well is to ask yourself, what about these research methods? Are they being appropriately chosen and appropriately used? And if you don't have that expertise, let's say the paper is extremely statistical and you're not an expert statistician like me, get back in touch with the editor and flag that as an issue so that they can find somebody else who will be able to evaluate that component of the research. We've also put together a few things to think about when you assess an article as a peer reviewer. A few key things to think about when assessing a paper for potential publication. Is the journal choice appropriate? That's an initial question that you can ask yourself. I'm reviewing for an international high impact factor journal, and this study is just about a very local question specific to the researcher's country. Is it really something that should be published in a big high impact factor international journal? Is the hypothesis, is the method appropriate? As we talked about before, that's very, very important as a starting point for peer review. What do you think of the study? Your opinion. Often journal editors will be very interested in what you think about a particular study. Are you then going to be able, with your peer reviewer's hat on, are you going to be able to provide a thoughtful, positive, balanced assessment? Don't fall into the trap of being negative. Don't fall into the trap of cutting the paper down, chopping it down, finding reasons to get it rejected. That's not what the process is all about. We want to see a thoughtful and balanced assessment of the research and comment on the science, comment on the content, not the writing, not necessarily the writing. Although if you think the paper needs to be rewritten or read or edited by a native speaker, that's a valid comment that you can make, but you're not going to be going in and editing the paper. That's not your role as a peer reviewer. Focus on improving the science. Focus on improving the content, not the language. And as we've mentioned already, journals are different. Some, like Bentham, will give you a checklist to help you with the peer review process, whereas others will not give you any help at all. But this is key. You're commenting on the content, on the science, not the writing. If you think the language is hard to understand, then send the paper back to the editor. Send the editor an email and say, I think this paper would benefit from an edit by a native English speaker. That's a valid concern, of course. And again, if you're listening to this and thinking, well, I need help with my English writing, I need help with my editing skills, we have those kinds of training courses as well. Do get in touch with us at SciTrain. Get in touch with Scott and I at the end of this event. Of course, we would be delighted to give you access to one of our webinars on English writing, grammar skills, managing the submission process, preparing your paper for publication. And I think it's a good technique when you're doing a peer review, when performing a peer review for a journal. Learn to read or have a go at reading a paper in 3 different ways. And this is a great exercise as well for you as a researcher when you put your own work together for submission to journals. Have a think about what somebody else in the field would think about your research. Somebody else working in the same research field, somebody that you've never met before. What would they think about the study? Do they understand the content and the focus of the work? What about competitors? What about somebody who would actively be competing with you as a researcher in your field? What would they think about the research? And you can put that hat on too. You can put yourself into the mindset of a competitor in your research field, and you can think, what would they say about the study? But of course, you've got to remain fair and balanced while you do that, which of course is quite difficult to do. We know that, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And then thirdly, have a think about what you've got to review, what you've got to look at as a peer reviewer, and imagine that you're a colleague working in the same department at the same university. What friendly comments are you going to give the person in the office next to you to help them improve the quality of their work? So this is a good technique for doing an effective peer review, learning to read a paper in 3 different ways: as somebody else in the field, as a competitor, and then as a colleague working in the same department. So do have a think about these aspects, ways to build an effective peer review report when you're doing one for a journal, but your report is not about the language. Start with overall comments. What's good and what's not about the study? List the strengths and the weaknesses of the work, and then be specific. Give those section by section comments on the work that you're being asked to peer review. And do take your time to ensure a good, accurate peer review. Why is that a good idea? If you do a good job for the journal in question, that makes you look good to the editor. They will want to use you again in the future, and it can even increase your chances of getting your own work published in that journal. So do think about what to include, how much time it's going to take, and how you're going to do a good job when putting together a peer review report. And of course, it happens. Sometimes you're going to have to reject a paper. Sometimes you have to say, I don't think this is a very good piece of work. It should be rejected. In these situations, it can often be a good thing to be anonymous. It can be a good thing to be reviewing double blind. You can follow the journal's guidelines to answer these questions. If you don't think the work is good enough, if you don't think it can be improved for submission to that journal, what about another journal? And some journals, indeed high impact factor journals, will ask you often at the start of the process, is this paper suitable for our readership? This is actually the first question that big journals like Nature and Science ask editors, ask peer reviewers before peer reviewers even start to work on papers. Is it going to be interesting for the readership of our journal? Very, very important initial question. So have a think about that as well, because the most important thing is to be positive. Absolutely. Constructive positivity in peer review is a key transferable skill. How can you find ways to help the author improve? Far too often, as I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute in our Q&A session, far too often reviewers think, how can I find a way to reject this paper. That's not a good strategy for you in your career. Imagine if your boss gives you something to comment on and you are overly negative and overly aggressive. That's not a good career strategy, and the same is true of peer review. Your colleagues and your collaborators will appreciate positive impact, positive input on their research. So these are a few ideas why it's a good idea to be a peer reviewer, how this can benefit your career, and we've also, in this event today, given a few tips and tricks for performing peer review. Scott, how's it going? How are we doing? Everything going well?
Going great, and we've got some great comments coming in from our guests in the chat, sharing their peer review experiences. And I've noticed a couple of common themes. One of them is that, yes, sometimes slow feedback can happen. There can be slowdowns in the process. And as we'll see in this upcoming section, a lot of the problems that we face, the most common problems, can be solved with good communication. For example, if you are slow to get feedback from the journal, it's best to reach out politely and inquire on the status, or offer to recommend peer reviewers. As you're going to explain very shortly, Professor, there are all kinds of ways where we can solve peer review problems just with good, polite, clear communication with the journals and editors. So looking forward to this next section, Professor.
One of our favorite bits, talking about communication skills when you talk to peer reviewers and editors, because you'd be amazed how many quite negative comments we get at our editorial office from both authors and peer reviewers. But constructive comments, politeness is always the best way, not just dealing with peer review, but also in life, right, Scott, as we manage our communication with everybody else around us.
Absolutely. And one of the themes that I've noticed from your talk today, Professor, is the idea that, of course, we have to, as critical peer reviewers, focus on the weaknesses, particularly the science of the paper, if you're peer reviewing. But also, we need to remain positive and we need to be supportive of authors. The goal is not to find ways to reject a paper, but rather find ways to support the author to improve their paper. And I think that's something that peer reviewers would be best to keep in mind as they're reviewing.
Absolutely. I'm afraid it's not often all that common, but we've all experienced it as authors, those super negative comments coming back at our work. So let's talk a little bit about communication. The starting point for this is the editorial office. And initially, we clear up a bit of confusion amongst authors around what an editor actually is, because the word editor in English can mean several different things. As you can see here on this slide, you're the author with your head banging against the desk. You may encounter a language editor. That's a person responsible for helping you with the language, as well as an academic editor who will be handling the submissions coming in to the journal. And above that sit managing editors who look at portfolios of journals, who manage the business perspective at publishers. So your main point of contact will be with an academic editor. Keep in mind that very often these academic editors, these editors-in-chief at journals, like the journals at Bentham, they're not employed by the publisher. They're active researchers with other things to do. So that's also very important to keep in mind. You will be talking to somebody who's an academic just like you, a researcher just like you. And at the initial stage, of course, when papers go into journals, into the editorial office in the first place, editors are thinking, does this submission fit with the journal's scope? Does it have a clear message? Is it original? Is it important? Is it true? And is it relevant to our readers? You've got to sell yourself to get your work through triage. Very important as well to keep that in mind, because higher impact factor journals, they want to maintain those high rejection rates. So have a think about how you're selling your submission to a journal as well. Because, hi, where is my paper? I've waited 2 months looking forward to an immediate reply is an email you could write, but it won't make such a great impression on the editorial office. What we're looking for is something more polite, constructive, and helpful. Can I make some additional suggestions for peer reviewers? For example, I'm writing with the manuscript number to ask for an update on my paper, being helpful and polite, communicating effectively. And don't forget as well, as an author, when you get comments back on your paper, there's going to be minor versus major revisions. If you get minor revisions, then probably the paper will not be going back to the same peer reviewers. Whereas major comments, comprehensive changes, your peer reviewers will almost certainly at least be given the opportunity to look at the paper again. So what you write in response to comments received in peer review has to be carefully worded, because the peer reviewers may very well get to see what you write. So be comprehensive, show the editor that you take the process seriously, and make sure you are polite and constructive at all stages. Because, you know, we've collected some good examples and some bad examples of the kinds of comments that authors often make in response to peer review. It's not necessary to change. We simply don't have the data. I do not think the reviewers understand my point. They might be true, but these are not the best ways to respond when under the spotlight, when under the peer review process. And we've given you a few examples as well on the slide of things you could say instead to make sure that your paper has a better chance of eventual acceptance. And a good technique when responding to peer review comments is to thank the reviewers for their time, to say that you've made all the changes, and then interleave your comments with the changes that you've made, so that the editor can quickly and easily go through the document and see everything that you've done. As shown here, this is the comment, this is the change. This is the comment, this is the change. All the way through the document, it's a good idea to do this to show the editor that you take the process seriously and that you have been comprehensive. And of course, we've got lots of templates to help with this kind of thing. We'll be giving you a couple of these at the end of our event today. This is a template for managing responses to peer review. And we'll give you this. You can edit this. You can take the Word document template. You can change it for your next article submission. What about if your paper's taking too much time in the peer review process? Don't wait. Communicate. Get in touch with the journal. Here's a template for doing that as well. We'll give you this in an attachment at the end of the event. Generally, if you haven't got news back on a paper that you've submitted to a journal after 6 to 8 weeks, then that's the time to get in touch, give the editor information about the submission, maybe suggest a few more peer reviewers. Don't forget that your editor is probably an academic like you, very, very busy. They couldn't find peer reviewers. They're just too busy. That's important to keep in mind. And also, don't forget that the way you respond to article rejection at international journals can also affect your career. If you get a rejection letter from a journal and you think you've been unfairly treated, well, get in touch with us. We can help you to rewrite it. We can help you to manage that. You can always appeal that rejection to the journal. And it's worth doing this if you feel you've been unfairly treated, because the editor may change their mind. If you've got a good example, if you've got good arguments, if you can rebut the comments that have been made by the peer reviewers to reject your paper, it's worth appealing that outcome. Because what's the worst that can happen at the end of the day? The paper's been rejected. It's going to stay rejected. That's the worst outcome. But you might get another round of peer review, which would be absolutely fantastic. And I have a number of examples from my research career where we thought we'd been rejected. We appealed with good arguments. The journal editor agreed to send the paper out for peer review again, and the paper eventually got accepted. So dealing positively, constructively with rejection is another key to success as an international researcher. And don't do this. Dear editor, thank you for reviewing my paper. We've made some minor modifications and we've added 2 more authors. This is not okay. When you make a submission to a journal, you are expected at that point to have informed all of your co-authors, received their agreement for the submission. You cannot add authors later on in the process. And by the way, this really raises red flags at journals and publishers, because they think that perhaps you're adding extra people to the paper late in the process as some kind of gift authorship. So very, very, very difficult to do this. Lots of paperwork will be involved. Make sure you've got all of the co-authors on your paper before you make a submission. Sending a paper to a journal requires all authors to know about and support its submission. Trying to add authors after acceptance immediately causes heart attacks at the editorial office. Any changes or additions to authorship after journal submission require explanation and approval, by the way, from all of your other co-authors. You'll have to send a document, get everybody to sign it. Journals absolutely hate having to deal with these situations. And lastly, let me also say that you need to have an ORCID ID. If you don't have one, immediately go over to orcid.org. It's a not-for-profit charity that helps researchers identify themselves, differentiate themselves from other researchers around the world. It's a persistent digital identifier that distinguishes you from other researchers, and it's very important to make sure that you have one for submission, but also for peer review. If you do peer review for a journal, for a publisher, they will potentially use your ORCID ID to identify you and reward you in the future. So that's important as well. Make sure you get the credit for the work that you do for journals and publishers. The point of all of this, and quite a lot of what we talk about in our SciTrain workshops and webinars, Scott and I, it's all about communication skills. It's a key skill. You can learn to be a better communicator, presenting skills, writing skills, submitting skills, dealing with peer review, being a peer reviewer as well. This will help you to maximize your success as a researcher throughout your career. And so with that, I think it's time for a Q&A. I'm sure there's lots of comments and questions in the chat box. We've talked about what peer review is, why you should be a peer reviewer, and some communication skills in peer review. How's it going, Scott? How are we doing? Everything okay?
Going great. We've got some excellent questions from our guests tonight. Some of the questions that I share with our guests. And as always, Gareth, thank you for sharing your expertise with us. I always learn so much doing these events together with you. So let's go through some of our guest questions. And I noticed some themes among the questions and in the chat. So one of the common questions that some of our guests are experiencing is this one here. And our guest asks, how should an author or editor navigate a situation where two peer reviewers provide conflicting feedback, such as one suggesting significant changes to the other methodology while the other reviewer praises it, the methodology that is. So what criteria should guide the decision on whose feedback to prioritize, and how can the author address those opposing viewpoints in their revisions? So again, the question is how to deal with conflicting feedback between reviewers. Fantastic question. Thank you for this question. Professor, as an author yourself of more than 300 papers, as a journal editor yourself, and as someone who works with authors to help them get published, any thoughts on how to deal with this kind of conflicting feedback between reviewers?
This is a really fantastic question. Thank you so much for asking it. If you've gotten those comments back from a journal, if you've received two reviews back from a journal that are conflicting in the way that you've described, and you're receiving no guidance in the letter that you've gotten from the journal from the editor, my next step with that would be to write an email to the editor and say, I have received conflicting peer reviews. Reviewer 1 says this, while reviewer 2 says this. There's a question about the methodology because, just list briefly in an email back to the editor the areas of conflict and ask the editor for guidance on this, because the editor, unfortunately, in this situation that you're describing is not doing their job properly, because the whole point of an editor at a journal is to deal with situations like this. Two conflicting reviews come back in. The next stage would normally be to ask a third person to look at the paper. Or if the editor has expertise in this subject area themselves, then they would say to the author, we've received conflicting reviews, please prioritize the comments of reviewer 2. So I wouldn't spend a lot of time worrying about this on your own in isolation. Very, very important if this has happened to you and you've received conflicting conflicting reports like as you've described that are so different that you can't figure out which one is the right one to follow, go back to the editor? That's a really fantastic question, and I hope that our answer is helpful. We're here if you need to follow up with us afterwards as well.
Thank you, Professor, as always, for your insights. And we've got lots more great questions coming in. So here's another one that came up as a common theme tonight. So as peer reviewers, how can you handle papers that fall outside your direct area of expertise? Now, you mentioned this in your presentation, something to consider carefully before accepting a peer review if you have the expertise in that field. But how should you handle this as a peer reviewer? You see the opportunity to do a peer review, but you're not sure if it's directly in your field or specialization. Any thoughts on this, Gareth?
I think that's another fantastic question. And again, like if you receive a review request from a journal and you can see that, hey, I know something about this area, but it's not directly my specific research area. Again, I would write to the editor. First thing to do, communicate with the editor. I would say that to the editor. Hey, this is a really interesting paper. I'd love to provide some comments, but it's not my main area of research. So that the editor is aware that they maybe have to find somebody else as well as you, or maybe two more people as well as you, who are actually subject area specialists. And this, by the way, happens a lot with statistics in research papers. And I see a comment in the chat box. Can we have a presentation about statistics? I'm sure Scott will address that in just a moment. It happens all the time. People say, I can comment on the research, but not the analysis because I'm not with that level of expertise. Just talk to the editor, flag that to the editor, let them make a decision. So that's another fantastic question. Great questions today.
Indeed, fantastic questions. And plenty more coming in as well. I think we still have time, do we not, Professor? Actually, this is a great question as well that we often get asked at these events. What resources or training would you recommend for reviewers looking to improve their skills? Well, Professor, I can think of at least one. Any suggestions?
Well, I mean, we have training courses. You're in one at the moment. And scitrain.com, I see Scott's pasted the link in the chat box already. We provide specific training on peer review. And so if you're interested in that, we'd be delighted to help you, to provide you with the link or provide you with a live training session on peer review. There are, of course, loads of resources out there. You just have to Google peer review training and you'll get hundreds and hundreds of different options. So lots of opportunities to get skills. I would also quickly recommend reviewercredits.com, which is a place where you can go to sign up and get rewarded for the peer review that you do for journals and publishers. And Bentham too operates the same kind of system. You do a peer review for Bentham and you do it quickly and you do it well, they'll give you discounts on all kinds of publication services, post-publication services as well. Another fantastic question. Thank you.
Great question. Thanks for your question. And thank you, Professor, for your answer. Here's another question. I love this question. Our guest asks, what steps can peer reviewers take to ensure their feedback contributes meaningfully to the advancement of knowledge in their field? A great ethical question on the advancement of science. Again, what steps can peer reviewers take to ensure their feedback contributes meaningfully to the advancement of knowledge in their field? Great question. Professor, your thoughts?
Wow. Well, aren't we getting some amazing questions in this event today? That's absolutely fantastic. I mean, other than having a look at the tips that we've provided you with in this training session today, I would say number one, make sure that you give it the time that it deserves, because there's nothing worse as an editor than just getting great paper, accepted immediately kinds of comments back from peer reviewers. Take the time to do a good and thorough job and provide comments on the different aspects of the research, focusing, of course, on where you have the most expertise yourself. But I would say, yeah, you can build out using some of the templates that we've talked about today, focusing on the method section, of course, but, making constructive comments, suggestions for improvement. That's, I think, the best way to contribute to the advancement of science in your field, like we've talked about before. Scott was mentioning this a moment ago. You don't be as negative as possible to try to get the paper rejected as quickly as possible by pointing out all of the immediate problems, let's think about how we can turn it into a positive experience, help the authors get their paper to the standard required for publication in that journal.
Fantastic question, and thanks for your answer as always, Professor. It is inspiring to hear that kind of question. And I also wanted to say, speaking of positive experience and inspiration, thanks to all of our guests for your positive comments. We're really happy to hear that this presentation has been useful for you. And some of you had mentioned that you felt inspired by Professor Dyke's talk tonight. So thank you, Professor, and thank you to our guests for all of the positive feedback. And we're so happy that this talk has been helpful for you.
Absolutely. And just before we finish, let's talk about, we have a statistical analysis presentation in response to one of those comments, and we're working on a number of other training sessions on statistics, right, Scott?
Absolutely. Yeah, we do have some new members joining us with expertise in stats and stats analysis, and we're really excited to be developing some new training in those areas. So stay tuned. Visit us at scitrain.com, sci-train.com, and yeah, visit us for updates. And for librarians out there, Gareth, we've got a free trial available for all librarians out there.
Right. We mentioned it at the beginning in case you were poised with your phone to scan the QR code, but the slide went away. Here it is again. You can scan it now, or you can take a screenshot and share it with your librarian at your university, at your institution. It's a great offer that we have from Bentham Science. All of the content, free access for 3 months, which is not normally available. We usually only allow people to get access to all of our content if they've paid for a subscription, but do have a look at this offer, this 3-month free trial. Absolutely fantastic. You can access all of those Bentham journals with impact factors at the touch of a button. Fantastic.
And for our guests asking about certificates, video, and the email templates that we mentioned, we'll be sending those all out tomorrow at around this time by email. So again, that's a certificate for joining. Thanks for joining. The full video recording, although we do not share the slides, we do share the full video with transcript and summary. And that will be sent out to you by a link tomorrow. And also we'll email you the letter writing templates so that you can stay in polite and constant contact with your journal to get status updates and so on. So if you want to respond to peer review comments or just reach out to the journal, we've got a template to send you. So tomorrow we'll send you that certificate, video link, and the email templates that Gareth mentioned.
And we do these events once a month for Bentham. So there's a website you can go to on the Bentham Science homepage that gives you access. You can go there, you can visit that page, you can see the webinars that are coming up in the future from Bentham Science. You can sign up, or you can sign up for all of them now if you like. Absolutely fantastic. Usually on the last or second to last Thursday of the month, we're doing these events. So thank you everybody for joining, and do follow Bentham Science on their various social media channels. Brilliant. Thanks so much, Scott.
Thank you, Professor, and thanks to all our guests. Have a wonderful Thursday, everyone, and thanks for joining us today.